Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome all of you on behalf of the Dean Maria Perbellini, Dean of the School of Architecture and Design at the New York Tech. I'm Chair Associate Professor Giovanni Santamaria, and I would like to now give the audio and video to the Professor Pablo Lorenzo Iroa, Chair of the Lecture and Event Committee at the School of Architecture and Design. Pablo.
Welcome everybody to this evening's semester's lecture series. Today we have a special event. The semester theme is called Correlational Crisis. 2020 marked a critical year in which environmental, health, economic and social crises have become correlated, bringing forth the emergence and unforeseen global issues to be addressed with a sense of urgency. The 2021 Lectures and Event Series at the School of Architecture and Design at the New York Institute of Technology creates opportunities to discuss how architecture, design, and urbanism can disclose implicit parameters and activate structural transformations in our ecological and built social environments. From how reality is measured to how it is validated to automation and computational thinking, the series aims to question possibilities for disciplinary action. Today's event celebrates the three MS programs, the Interior Design, the M.Arch, and the MS in Urban Design. And the idea is to have a representative speaker for each of these programs to show what they are doing in their research and current explorations at their practices or different type of research work. The title for today's evening is Visions and Trajectories for Higher Education and Practice. And the event is structured in the following way. We're going to have an introduction, and then each speaker is going to be introduced by a different director of each of the programs. And then after, we're going to have a moderated discussions and questions by the audience. The introduction and moderation is going to be done by Trudy Brens, who is the interim director of the Interior Design Program at New York Institute of Technology School of Architecture and Design. David Diamond is the director of the M.Arch program in New York Tech School of Architecture and Design. And Marcella Signore is the director of the MS in Architecture, Urban and Regional Design at New York Institute of Technology School of Architecture and Design. This evening, we're going to have three presentations. Depending on the order, we may switch slightly, but Saskia Sassent is going to present Going Transversal Beyond Knowledge Silos. And Saskia is a Robert S. Lind Professor of Sociology at Columbia University. We are then going to have a presentation by Michael Manfredi, Connected Horizons. Michael Manfredi is FAIA partner and Weiss Manfredi. And lastly, we're going to have a presentation by Paul Lewis, LTL Architects in Section. Paul Lewis is a professor and associate dean at Princeton University School of Architecture and the principal of LTL Architects. Now I'm going to give the word to my colleague, Marcella Signore, who's going to introduce, I don't know if we have Saskia yet, or if not, David is going to introduce our first speaker, Michael Manfredi. David?
I will take that as my cue to introduce our first speaker this evening. I'm pleased to welcome Michael Manfredi, co-founder of Weiss MANFREDI Architecture, Landscape Urbanism, based in New York City. And Michael is currently a Senior Design Critic at Harvard University. His multidisciplinary firm is at the forefront of architectural design practices that are redefining the relationships between landscape, architecture, infrastructure, and art. Manfredi was born in Trieste, Italy, and grew up in Rome. Completed his Bachelor of Architecture at the University of Notre Dame and his Master of Architecture at Cornell University, where he studied with Colin Rowe. He is a recipient of the Paris Prize, a Cornell Fellow, and was awarded the Eidlitz Fellowship. He has taught design studios at Yale University, University of Pennsylvania, Princeton University, and the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, Cornell, and most recently at Harvard University, and is co-author of some of the most exciting urban, architectural, and landscape work being done today. Michael.
Thank you, David. That was a very generous introduction, and I'm very, very pleased to be here. And I think I will launch in. Okay. Can everybody see the title slide?
Yes.
Great. Good. Good. Okay. Well, I think now that we've got technology working, it is a pleasure to be here. And I just start by, I think, this sort of slide, I think, states the obvious, which is, I think, what we all know is that design has acquired a new urgency. And I think we all are up to the task of facing that particular urgency. And I think with these kinds of extreme conditions, we can't be complacent. And we have to kind of go beyond polishing the tip of the architectural pyramid to find a much more expansive role for architecture, for design in general. And I think my partner and I, Marian Weiss, and our office tend to want to sidestep the idea of a kind of utopian urbanism in favor of a perhaps more tactical approach. This approach isn't necessarily new, but it, I think, has acquired a new level of urgency. And I go back to this particular image because I realized that it grew over time, and design, I think, is a kind of an incremental process, but one that, again, sidesteps a kind of a singular strategies, singular methodologies. And since we are speaking about the nexus of architecture as a practice and architecture as a discipline in the academy, I think it'd be fair to say that all of us see that kind of interaction as completely interwoven. And the kind of books that we produced in our office are always sort of paired up and marry up with work that we're actively doing in the studio context. So the kind of reciprocity between the academic world and the professional world for us has completely collapsed. And I think since this is NYIT, I'd like to make a special citation to this very, very powerful book written by the late professor at NYIT, Michelle Bertone. She and I had many conversations about architecture's capacity to be expansive, to be infrastructural, to be systemic. And I think I owe a great deal to her. And similarly to Michael Schwarting for discussions about Rome, not in a kind of sentimental way, but understanding Rome as a kind of evolving and accretive kind of process. So I am very happy to be back in company with a number of colleagues, and very nice to see David Diamond and Friedman. So let me start with a series of projects, a very small project for the Venice Biennale. And it does go back to the realization that we are always in our practice looking at precedent, looking at projects that are hybrid projects that can't be clearly defined, Indian stepwells, the work by Plechnik in Ljubljana. And they inform our work, and we realize that we're part of a much larger trajectory. And in the context of our academic work, studio works, we've tried to probe through the use of models, digital and analog, trying to uncover how these particular precedents or case studies worked, and particularly how they might be relevant. So at the Venice Biennale, we were asked to present our work, and we decided to expand and talk about some historic precedents that have informed our work. And it was about making a place at the Arsenale, which is a very, very large, vast, and heroic space. So that idea was to take these two conoidal shapes that would be self-supporting and to create a kind of place of quiet, a place where you could contemplate something perhaps a little more immersive and more intimate. And as you can start to see, the kind of exterior of the shell brings into focus the kind of shipbuilding tradition that one finds in Venice through very contemporary technology. This was done and milled in a very sophisticated workshop in Treviso, not too far away. The interior is lined with corian and becomes a surface against which you can project images and conversations. So it has a kind of a dual outside, very rough, like a geode, and then inside, much more polished. But we were also interested in the idea of scaling and finding reciprocities between the scale of the Arsenale and something perhaps a little more intimate, where you could immerse yourself, in this case, a model of one of our projects that then gets paired with its sort of inspirational antecedents. So from there, I'd like to just kind of shift to a project that's a very much of a hybrid project that we initiated over 10 years ago at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. Now, the Botanic Garden in Brooklyn is actually an amazing institution insofar as it's embedded in one of the most dense metropolises, dense parts of New York City, and it's this oasis. And it's very interesting because it's always had this kind of very interesting relationship as an oasis in a city and very much a part of a very dynamic borough. So the task was to create a sort of inhabitable threshold that would take you from the city into the garden. And that idea of a kind of transition was about creating a building that was as much a pathway as it was a destination unto itself. So we've stretched the building out to about 200 feet long. It's a very, very thin building and follows one of the Olmstedian paths. The Botanic Garden was laid out by the Olmsted brothers at the turn of the century. So the building is overtly architectural as it meets Washington Avenue, actually, and then becomes a little bit more of a kind of a way in which it kind of assumes a more topographic sensibility. So there's a sort of transition from the architectural to the topographic, from landscape to architecture, architecture to landscape. It's also a very hard-working machine. We are, I think, in the discussion of global warming, the preciousness of water. And here it's an instrument to kind of take water, detain it, capture it through various modes, green roofs, rain gardens, and the water moves into the Japanese pond, is cleansed, and then recirculated at the southern end of the Botanic Garden. So it is literally a machine for moving water and capturing it. It's also a way in which we can kind of choreograph movement, and Mary and I are particularly interested in architecture's capacity to choreograph how people move through space. So at times you can move and slide by the building, never enter it, but always perceiving the kind of edge condition of architecture to garden. And in some cases, the building humbly acknowledges, in this case, this very beautiful drip line of a very rare green cherry tree. So the landscape itself, the kind of horticultural elements, define or enter into a conversation with the architecture. You can enter the building. There's a kind of parallel path that talks about the garden itself, the kinds of things that are in the garden. And there are also places to kind of quiet down. This becomes a community room that is sort of a two-sided room, like the shape of a cherry leaf, that hosts all sorts of formal and informal, spontaneous and programmed events. And you can see that room taking shape and forming the kind of western edge of the visitor center. It's also a building that can be entered sectionally at an elevated second floor. You can slide through. You actually can look, you can see the clear story. You can look into this room as you slide down and approach the main level. At times, the building is, in a way, a meter or a cipher for the contours themselves. The sort of edges of the overtly architectural elements allow you to kind of understand and meter both the planimetric adjustments of the building itself, but also the sectional adjustments, the kind of topographic adjustments. At times, the building almost, we hope, disappears in the garden and whispers. And we've, I think, been the beneficiaries of just completing a second project there, which is the Robert Wilson Overlook. And this is an overtly landscape project, but I think you could sense when I share this, its deep roots in architectural's capacity to shape space and allow you to move through space. It is, in a way, reclaiming an orphan part of the Botanic Garden, the sort of the last piece of the garden that had not been turned into kind of a horticultural display. And it takes the kind of idea of this sort of sectional shift from city to garden to its conclusion. So the slide at the bottom, the section, the MRI section at the bottom, is the entry to the visitor center. And then at the very top is the Overlook itself. So it's about 600 feet long, and it's also a way of making the garden accessible from the upper levels, which are subway accessible, to the lower levels. Previously, the garden had not been interconnected in an accessible way. So it's effectively a giant ADA ramp. But the idea was to make the sort of ADA ramp a place, not just a route through. So there are approximately 214 individually precast panels, each with a unique shape that allow you to, in a way, stabilize the earth because it's a change of grade of about 26 feet, but also negotiate a very comfortable ramp that has, in effect, a set of places, a set of mini belvederes to take in the splendor of the garden. So you can start to see how these sort of precast panels allow you to kind of meter the slope and allow a very rich collection of vegetation. This is also a crepe myrtle garden. Crepe myrtles are beautiful trees that blossom in the summer. And the idea of choreographing space, this kind of cinematic qualities, is something that I'll return to. It's been a long-standing obsession with us as we have been developing. So just do a quick film that I think will work, perhaps. Nope. Okay. Well, we'll skip the film and go to La Brea, which is a very expansive project that we're currently working on in a very different context, but I think shares the same sensibilities. La Brea is about the Pleistocene, and it's about the past that literally finds its presence in the present, very much in LA, a city of the future. And literally, it is a tar pit that is active with methane bubbles bubbling up and finding a kind of finding their surface effectively. So it's a very strange site, a very strange project, but an extraordinary one. So you have an active archaeological dig, you have a museum, and you have a public park, all conflated over the course of 16 acres. The site, as I said, is active. There are ongoing research pits that are bringing fossils to the surface, and it very much is about, the relevance is very much about the climate change that occurred in very dramatic ways during the Pleistocene. So it's extremely relevant to our current condition. So here's the site, actually. LACMA, the museum, which you see in the middle of the screen, is being developed by Zumthorpe. And the site itself is, as I said, active research. It's a site of a museum and a site of Hancock Park. And in our sort of research into this project and how it might be developed, we kind of discerned sort of three areas of intensity, which we called spectacle and fiction, urban fictions on Wilshire Boulevard, which is the kind of main street of LA that many of you know. Culture and community, the sort of heart of this park, which is the Page Museum itself, the Paleontological Museum. And then research and revelation, the active research pits that make this park so unique and so much about both past, present, and future. So out of that research came the idea of establishing this kind of triple loop, a 1 kilometer loop that would engage all three kinds of programs, park, museum, and research activities, and treat them in a way that the kind of pedagogy of this whole site and museum could be foregrounded. So you could start to understand the Pleistocene relative to the Anthropocene, and relative to the Holocene, and start to understand how climate change might be perceived as not something new, but something that has been with us and is recurring in very dramatic and immediate ways. So that kind of pedagogical role to the site plan finds its measure in this illustrative site plan. The development of the project is such that you can start to see that we've enlarged the tar pits in the sort of lower left-hand part of your screen to bring them a little bit closer to Wilshire, so you can kind of sense the presence of the kind of Pleistocene. And the building with the space frame is the Page Museum, which we'll renovate, and then we're adding to it with this sort of elliptoid building and building up the kind of existing berm that exists. But it's also a realization that this is as much a project of the subsurface, and a way that that subsurface sort of bubbles up is something that's particularly interesting in terms of how we shape the site. And it is, as I said, sort of a series of both active tar seeps, but opportunities to engage them into the kind of fabric of the museum itself. So we can kind of turn the museum inside out, but also recognize that this, as a hub, sort of public park, has a kind of responsibility to establish a series of programs that make for a kind of healthy community. LA is underserved, drastically underserved in terms of open space. So bringing open space to a larger slice of the community is extremely important. So currently the entry is rather arid. As temperatures rise, particularly in LA, it becomes increasingly inhospitable. So shade equity is extremely important. So we're bringing a kind of giant canopy right up to the edge of the street to provide shade for anyone on Wilshire. And you can start to see how that kind of giant crescent makes for a more, we hope, processional entry into the newly reconfigured museum complex. That kind of triple loop continues, we hope, in a fairly effortless way to engage a number of activities that occur on site, in this case, research activities that can be expanded to accommodate kind of growing public and growing interest in the relevance of the Pleistocene. So the museum itself takes the existing page and then pairs it with another figure so that the two are kind of interlocked in this kind of slipped rectangle, slipped pair of squares. And that sort of slipped pair of squares internest or interconnect sectionally, where we try to kind of develop an idea of this sort of sense of being in the kind of in the tar pits themselves and seeing this kind of research emerge. There's a vast collection that we hope to make visible. And that collection is also visible in the sense that as an active research institution, you can actually understand how fossils are collected, cleansed, and studied. So there's a sort of active play between what typically would be a more passive engagement in this kind of subject matter. So you can see the main hall has a sort of large elliptoid kind of shape that allows for this collection to be displayed in a much more dramatic way. And then we hope at night, because this is a public park, the kind of museum turns itself inside out and can reveal through the kind of, in a way, the fantasy that one thinks of as so endemic to LA, a much richer set of stories. And in some ways, perhaps a more dramatic way of kind of collapsing past, present, and future. So if the last two projects were primarily expansive and extensive insofar as their kind of ambition and reach, this project at Yale is like acupuncture. It's a tiny little building, a couple thousand square feet, that tries to reanimate this rather bleak courtyard. So the idea was to take a kind of a pristine and self-contained shape, in this case, an ellipse, and use it as a way of engaging the multiple entries that are part of this emerging engineering complex, about 5 or 6 buildings that are currently not connected. It's barely visible, but we love the idea of establishing perhaps a Magritte-like presence off of Chapel Street. And you can start to see how the ellipsoid shape plays out as a kind of a two-story building that, in a way, by virtue of its kind of geometry, acts as a hinge by which a whole host of different kinds of architectures, different kinds of geometries might start to pivot. Also, I think we're very proud of the kind of more strategic interventions of connecting a series of open spaces, which was so critical. So the kind of concrete wall comes down, we can reestablish a connection to the rather beautiful Sterling courtyard. And the building is actually self-supporting glass. It's about 22.5 feet tall panels of glass that create this kind of set of very interesting optics as you move around and move into the space itself. And you can take in, for example, the kind of neo-Gothic Sterling courtyard, but also you can see hints of Marcel Breuer's Beckton Hall, this sort of robust concrete brutalist building. The building is also sheathed with a saffron curtain, which turns it into a kind of cocoon, both by day and night. So it can be an extremely introverted building, despite its size, or extremely extroverted. And here you can see, we wish we could take credit for the kind of playful, serendipitous reflections that occur over the course of the day in this sort of undulating, concave, convex set of glass panels. So at a different scale, very much a project like La Brea that's in process, the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, which is also undergoing extreme climate change. Here we have an opportunity to acknowledge Edward Durell Stone's exceptional U.S. Embassy, which I think at the time also tried to take modernism, advance, I think, a diplomatic mission too. And for us actually working in India was an opportunity to not only acknowledge this extraordinarily rich tradition, for example, Agra Fort with its very sculptural elements, but also the Lodi Gardens, the Mughal gardens have been a very long-standing source of inspiration for us. So in a way, this is about making a garden as much as it is expanding the embassy. So you see two buildings that are going to stay, Edward Durell Stone's Chancery and also the Ambassador's House, exceptional buildings. So the idea was to find ways in which the embassy could grow, and rather than think about the buildings, we thought about a kind of a connective route that would move through the two kind of block-long sort of parts of this campus. It's actually 2 blocks long. And the idea was to create a kind of a tapis vert, a kind of green carpet that would be the primary connective elements. And the buildings then, over time, over 10 years, 20 years, would grow around this sort of green carpet. And that green carpet has a sort of infrastructural agenda. It captures water. It allows the two buildings to be kind of interconnected, and it also provides shade. There are these light wells that kind of mitigate the harsh climate. The building itself, well, the Edward Durell Stone building is on the left and our building is on the right. They both share a very deep canopy that, again, captures water and provides shade. But India is also a place where the tradition of walls is important. Often we think of walls as exclusionary, but here it's a way of, in a way, introducing levels of both security, but also diplomatic protocol. So you can move from the sort of more clearly defined edges into more clearly defined precincts where the protocols are a little more highly attenuated. But the building and garden, building and landscape, I think we hope are in dialogue with each other. So you can enter, formal entry would be under a kind of grove of Dolonex trees. You can start to see the royal palms mark the kind of green corridor that identifies both new and old buildings. But the sort of primary genesis of this was to make sure that we could restore the Edward Durell Stone building, expand not by attaching to it, which would have been a crime, but to link to another adjacent building. So much of the program is below grade. again, they're these sort of light wells that provide cooling and capture water. So it's sectionally very dynamic. And again, the sort of use of walls to define spaces is something that builds on a very kind of ancient and very beautifully developed and sophisticated way of engaging space and materiality. So we're also confronted with mitigating very, very harsh sunlight. And again, there's an opportunity to build on the tradition of the jolly screen, which is a tradition that Edward Durrell Stone was actually very fascinated by in his attempt to kind of soften and bring a kind of environmental agenda to modernism. So we've developed this kind of striated screen that cools and provides shade from the harsh sunlight. There are multiple canopies. This is a consular entry, so this is one of the more public entries of the project. And then you can also see our attempt to treat water in an extremely precious way where we capture it, provide shade, because India, as you know, suffers from the extremes of too much rain or not enough rain. So we want to kind of also acknowledge the fact that the building is a giant umbrella, if you will. So I'll conclude with Hunter's Point. And this, I'll go quickly. I think many of you know Hunter's Point has a sort of multiple set of histories. And Mary and I started thinking about this project actually in the context of an academic set of studios about 12 years ago. And the idea was to kind of build on the research that had been done about climate change and resilience. So this giant green is actually a giant cistern. It's a big bathtub that collects water. And when Hurricane Sandy came along, it filled with water and actually protected the park from the backwash of water. The pavilion itself also is hardworking, and it too both collects water and powers the park through a series of kind of photovoltaic arrays. It's a long pavilion that stretches and hosts a number of different activities, but also allows us to reclaim the area or identify areas that were similar to the kind of pre-colonial waterfront, including extremely proficient and active wetlands. It frames views of New York, so the spectacle of New York is brought into sharp focus. But as a second part of the project has been completed, it's also a realization how important open space is in our kind of post-COVID world. This park stayed open and was safe haven for many families who couldn't afford to escape or didn't have a big co-op or a house in the suburbs. So it, I think in a way, reminded us all of the urgency of and the value of open space beyond its aesthetics. So this giant platform is built in Maine in a kind of shipbuilding facility, shipped down here. And then we've tried to reclaim with ARUP and TBA the wetlands that used to be so sort of prevalent in this area. It's a place that accommodates seasonal change, a place that accommodates different modes of transportation. So that, again, there's a sort of sectional agenda and an infrastructural agenda, a place to reclaim the waterfront in a public way, but also a place for intimacy. So you literally can walk on water when there's high tide. And with that, I will close with the idea that we can hopefully think of architecture's capacity to both heal, expand, and make vivid and measurable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Beautiful presentation. And I'd like to pass the microphone to Trudy Brens, please. Trudy, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. It's my great pleasure to welcome also our next speaker, Paul Lewis. Paul Lewis is FAIA and principal of LTL Architects based in New York City. He's also a professor and associate dean of the School of Architecture at Princeton. His firm has completed academic and cultural projects throughout the United States. LTL is the 2019 New York State AIA Firm of the Year. They have received National Design Awards, have been included into the Interior Design Hall of Fame, and have received multiple AIA Design Awards. LTL's most recent and amazing book is A Manual of Sections, and it has been translated into 5 languages. Paul is president of the Architectural League and a fellow of the American Academy in Rome. Please welcome him into our school.
Thank you, Trudy. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a little intimidating to follow Michael. The work is so extraordinarily good. It's an inspiration to watch it again and learn. Each time I see the work, I learn new things. So it's a great pleasure to be part of this. So thank you for inviting me to it. I'm going to go ahead and share screen. And you can, with thumbs up, make sure that this thing is fully operational. Are you getting the screen? Is everything showing up? All right, fantastic. So
looks great, Paul.
From our office. Uh-oh, Zoom has quit. Let's see if it's actually. Uh-oh. Are you hearing me by any chance? So.
Yes, we are hearing you.
You're frozen. But...
It's better if you have the Zoom downloaded instead of maybe using the browser. I'm not sure if you're doing that. You're muted. Okay, let's wait some minutes. While we wait for Paul, Michael, thank you so much for such an amazing presentation and congratulations for the work. We all, a lot of architects, I think, envy your practice because it's so broad and so interesting. You're doing amazing work everywhere, actually. So congratulations. And thank you for sharing the time with us.
And also thank you and welcome back to NYIT. Thank you for acknowledging your colleagues and recognizing their collaboration with you as well. It was a pleasure.
Okay, we have the presentation, Paul.
Okay, can you hear my voice? So,
yes. Yes.
All right, that's so far so good. There's always something that goes slightly wrong. So, and maybe I can actually show my video, and I may not actually, well, let me see. Let me give this a try. See if I can show, move it to slideshow mode, and hopefully it doesn't crash. So, all right, is that holding up? All right, my goodness, it wouldn't be a lecture without some kind of technical failure. So, all right, so look, want to present kind of work from our office through the kind of format of three different publications. And manual section that was that Trudy mentioned. We're also in the process of a kind of second volume looking at specifically house sections relative to questions of carbon, and manual of physical distancing, which we completed last summer. And I'll use the manual of section as a way to kind of talk about a couple of our projects. And this book was really motivated by our own interest in section, but also a kind of from a standpoint of teaching, kind of concern that there wasn't a lot of scholarship about section. There were a couple of really good essays, but that was about it. So we were very interested in developing a kind of better understanding, a better language of articulating how section works. What are the different ways architects deploy it? You know, section is fantastic, and certainly, you know, Michael and Marianne's work, they're experts at section. So I love looking at their work among many things, but particularly for how they work with section. And look, what section allows you to do is not only organize kind of social hierarchies, it allows you to configure the relationship between the building and the city. It's where thermal forces take place. It's where kind of the coordination between all the kind of technical issues. It's kind of amazing kind of representation that should be a design tool and not just a technical tool. And unfortunately, the history of architecture Architecture has positioned section as a kind of a backdrop, a kind of builder's tool, a kind of technique for deploying the facade. The plan in Palladio is dominant, the section is secondary, and the facade is really kind of propped up by the section. And in fact, the history of the drawing of sections actually is in a sense a kind of drawing that required existing bodies to be there, whether in Leonardo's case, the existing human body, or in the case of drawings of monuments of antiquity, the section was a way of actually understanding what already existed. And frankly, the way it's often used today is the 3D model in Rhino is developed and the section as a way to understand what you've developed three-dimensionally. And it's not used as instrumentally as a design tool unto itself. So its history and its current use are kind of aligned, and we're interested in kind of changing that, finding ways that this section is actually a catalyst for design. So for the book, we were also really interested in the parallel between section and perspective, two totally different drawing techniques. Section reveals what you can't see, what's in the thickness of the wall. It's measurable, it's analytic, it's abstract, whereas the perspective is all about optics and inhabitation and kind of illusion. And so the simultaneity of those two was very useful for us. We've often used section perspective in our own drawings, in our own work. And the book was specifically about trying to articulate a typology of section. What we felt were the 7 dominant models by which architects produce section. And then of course, most interesting buildings are hybrids, right? A kind of combination. So this is really a kind of means to understand things. It's not a kind of, it's not a goal. We're not arguing that any of these section types are good in isolation. It's the combination that's most relevant. So I'll explain a couple of these section types and be able to show our work relative to those section types. Again, for the book, we also wanted to develop a kind of scholarship through drawing. Architectural history doesn't have to be the history of text. It can also be the history of drawings. And so for us to get a level of precision in the work was crucial. So even when we were drawing and developing this model of Michael and Marion's fantastic center at Barnard, Michael generously redlined it, kind of marked it up. So we got a kind of an iterative kind of approach, but it's the section perspective as a way to kind of get at a particular reading. And for us, this was analytical and also a way to get at the complexity of architecture. Too often, analytical books are about 100 different diagrams that all take the project apart. And we were interested in a single drawing that you could show the complexity of the architecture, all occurring simultaneously, and not reduce architecture to a series of diagrams. So anyways, that's the kind of preface. So the dumbest section type is extrusion, which is basically take the plan and extrude it up to the height necessary for a program. It usually doesn't produce interesting sections, but there are moments where you have interesting effects. Certainly the glass house from Philip Johnson put so much emphasis on the glass, on the exchange between the exterior and the interior, between reflection, between natural environments and artificial ones. The extrusion becomes magical in its precision, if you will. And another example of an extruded section that was quite extraordinary is when it goes beyond the kind of conventional height. So in Nervi's Palace of Labor, 82-foot height, these columns, these individual kind of concrete columns with the steel kind of umbrella branching out. The gaps between them are skylights, and really that's the extruded space becomes a space of spectacle for this exhibition hall. So this first project I'll present is basically an extruded plan. So even though lecture about section or kind of talk about section, we're going to talk mostly about plan with this one. The site was relatively flat. The budget was really tight, so we couldn't even afford an elevator. And we knew that the program was for young children at such a young age that even ramps were kind of discouraged. So it was all going to be on one floor with inexpensive construction. So a lot of the work was about configuring the plan, kind of developing these double loaded corridors where you would get the same age group all kind of coordinated around an exterior space. And then internal to that, we wanted to find a way that these double corridors would then kind of sponsor a series of kind of houses, if you will, so that you would work down the hallway, witnessing a series of kind of domestic spaces placed as an entryway that would then become a kind of canopy or a room within a room internal to the classroom.
Mary, so you want to hear Paul Lewis?
And each of these things would be set up where you would get the identity of the classroom marked with a particular wood, windows height set up for kids' heights. And then that same space would extend into a felt-lined interior, making a kind of quieter room inside. And then that space continues all the way out. That kind of shape extends out and is picked up in the screen that's on the outside of this large enclosed kind of outside porch. And this was a really important space for us to be able to get 8-9 feet of space that would be inside an insect screen that would allow kids to go outside even if the weather may have not cooperated. And then you get the collection of these rooms all linking out to a play field that is at the age appropriate for the particular children in these classrooms. There are about 200 kids in this school, all ages from about 6 months to about 5 years, early childhood education program in Arkansas. The other thing we were interested in is that we knew that we had to enclose the play spaces, and by code you have to have a fence. Normally it's a 6-foot fence, and we said, let's extrude it all the way up to the height of the building. Let's let those fence poles become a marker. Let's register and enclose a space really through that extruded height. So here you see those markers extending around. They define and really make the play spaces part of the architecture. And at the front of the building, they're kind of attached as battens on the fiber cement board front facade, but they also migrate out in front of the building and become a kind of gathering, if you will, of these poles identifying the front entry to the building. So again, with kind of more minimal means, bringing a level of kind of specific dimension to the building. On the inside, we wanted there to be a collective room. And we knew that from an organization standpoint, we were going to back into a panopticon, which we were a little bit nervous about. And so we were like, all right, can we make a dysfunctional panopticon? Can we make a panopticon that doesn't have a single center, but has all kinds of centroids? So all of these corridors miss each other, and all of the arcs actually form centers that are at different locations. So there's a kind of collective area, but there's no single point of power. And so then that center point just uses inexpensive things like the drywall and billows the drywall out. So it kind of floats down one corridor, becomes a kind of thickness, and then moves down another. And then by opening up these apertures, we can get a kind of playful space just through the use of the inexpensive drywall. Those rooms open up, you can have larger gathering points within the heart of the building. Okay. So shape is a different kind of section which uses the contouring or the kind of sculpting of either the roof, the ceiling, or the floor, largely to gather collective programs. It's not always used that way, but it's frequently used that way. And when it's in the ceiling, it's often done for structural reasons. So if you look at Felix Candelia's work, the thin shell is both a response, a kind of form-finding response to structural questions, but it also organizes the restaurant in these smaller areas so you can break up the scale of the space and connect these smaller kind of dining areas out to the garden. In a different way, Utsen's church uses these amazing kind of concrete ceiling, undulating concrete ceiling, evoking the heavens, allowing indirect light in, but also coordinating and choreographing the space and the relationship between the minister and the congregation, right? And so that in a sense, the architecture is staging the relationship between the collection of people inside. There's also an amazing structural inversion where here, what appears as the drop ceiling is actual structural, and then the cladding is actually external to this billowing ceiling. So with a project we did at Columbia University in a renovation of a McKim and White building, we had all this existing mechanical system we had to deal with. And we also wanted to open up the windows. This is a kind of an auditorium or a kind of space where that gets used for multiple purposes. But one of the things that's happened is over the years, the windows have been blocked over. They've been kind of lost. And so we wanted to open those up while still allowing there to be space for all the mechanical stuff. So this was done by rethinking the coffer, developing a series of coffers that could be mechanical diffuses or lighting, or even at the back of the space, there's a very large video projector. These shift from being innies to outies. They sculpt away, but the key thing is they allow the view to continue to the windows and start to pick up those programs. That's the very large projector embedded in the roof of the ceiling. And of course, there's also an acoustic material. So but we also like the fact that it both gathers people, but it does encourage views out. It kind of does the opposite of the shaped ceiling that gathers people with a dome, but this one kind of pushes people and continues to encourage the connection to the windows and out to the landscapes around Columbia University. All right, so hole is pretty dumb. It's a hole. It's where you remove a chunk of floor, but in order to gain certain benefits. So it involves this negotiation that architects have to go through there, where they say, okay, we're going to lose a certain amount of square footage. There's going to be some expense to this, but the benefit of it is going to offset that kind of loss. And I should say a lot of the work in the manual section is trying to think about the agency of section with the efficiency of slab construction, or the efficiency of 20th century, mostly 20th century construction techniques, where one can just put floor after floor after floor. And if an architect argues for the absence of floor, you often have to justify it through other benefits. So a hole can be a mechanical system, an elevator, but it can also do other things. So a very simple version is Corbusier's double height space in the Weissenhof-Siedlung. It allows light to come deeper. It sets the hierarchy between the public gathering areas of the living room to the more private rooms up above. It opens up the space, brings air and continuity back into the project. But of course, it involved the kind of loss of that amount of real estate. Other holes become atriums, and certainly the Larkin building is primarily focused on its atrium, right? It's an internalized building. The pollution of Buffalo was such that the interior really became the main edifice, the heart of the project. And this atrium was not just an identity, a gathering point, it was a mechanical system, et cetera. Really, it's a tragic loss that it got demolished about 50 years after it opened. And probably one of the most ingenious uses of the hole as a section type is Toyo Ito, who combined the hole with a column, right? So two totally opposite strategies, one about holding up a building and the other perforating it and opening it up. So here the holes allow connection, they allow circulation, they allow mechanical systems, they also allow optical connection between the floors, and all done at the same time while it's holding the building up. These aerated columns are pretty ingenious. So, with adaptive reuse projects, we've often worked with kind of tactical deployment of holes, removing chunks of floor to open up spaces. So this is a contemporary art center in Texas. Used to be a theater, became a department store in the 50s. And so for us, we had, again, with a tight budget, trying to figure out where we get the most effect. A lot of the work was done through vertical circulation, locating kind of holes, if you will, in the existing slab. And one of the key moments of that was actually at the front, developing the stair that would be both heavy. 3 treads are quite, cast in place, quite substantial, whereas the other treads are all suspended from the ceiling up above. And this, in a sense, brings you up into the main gallery. And the stairs are literally suspended off of the 2 existing floor plates through the holes that were cut in them. And then they actually slope at the angle of the nosing. So the very detail of the nosing now generates the overall geometry. And because that slope occurs in both directions, you end up getting an incline that in effect allows the stair to be wider at the top than it is lower. It's 5 feet below, it's 8 feet there. So as you work your way up through this stair, it has a sense of opening up. At the same time, from the upper gallery, you can look down and view all the way to the sidewalk. So this connection, urban connection, if you will, being made through the simple act of a communicating stair. Now, we had the interesting problem of dealing with the elevator. We got the chance to come back and to do it kind of a renovation to the renovation. And one of the key questions was they needed better vertical circulation for crates. And so we didn't want to lose any square footage for the elevator that might only get used 3 or 4 times a year. So the thought was, let's just, in a sense, cut a hole in the ceiling, cut a hole in the floor, locate a scissor lift that would actually allow you to kind of move up the crates when you need, and then just fill in the hole and return the floor plate back to where it was. So a kind of magically disappearing hole, if you will. Other aspects, we're trying to figure out ways that we could use the tracks or use the bottom chord of the trusses as a track for a wall that could be configured to produce a white wall gallery, or within a minute just disappear and open up this very interesting kind of accumulation of history on the existing facade or interior facade. And then on the rooftop, one of our interests was, when we were asked to come back, is to find a way you could protect this rooftop against the heat of the Austin sun. So this effectively involved kind of an extruded section here, 23 feet, floating a kind of a knife-edged kind of shade canopy, becomes the backdrop for Jim Hodges' art installation with Liberty and Justice for All. It's a kind of great backdrop for protests up and down the main Congress Avenue within Austin. And using curtains, we found ways that you can, in effect, enclose the whole space. But mostly it's a kind of outside space that then connects you to the city. So it's protected, but it's also connected. And that was a super important aspect of the project, is to not make it internalized, to make it connected back out to the city. Okay, so I think nest is I think the last section type I'll show, which is different than some of the other section types, where it involves not floor plates as the common denominator, but a volume of space. And these can be intersected, they can be overlapped, or they can be just simply placed inside of each other. So Fujimoto's house is a kind of quintessential nested section, self-similar volumes, similar in the sense that their apertures are the same, but they start to mark different things, transitions between a kind of an interior domestic program to a slightly supportive one, between the interior conditioned space and the outside space, and then even closer to the edge of the property. So you get this complex intersection of spaces through the use of the nested section. Nested sections are great for thermal performance. It allows you to develop in this particular project, a kind of volume within a volume. Here, these relatively straightforward buildings are then placed inside this passive skin that then modulates the temperature, so that you then have a much smaller difference or delta between the temperature on this kind of interstitial space and then the space you're trying to condition. But in the process, it produces this extraordinary exterior, interior, something that's in between. And so the idea that the skin of a building now becomes an inhabitable gradient is something we find really interesting. So I think the last LTL project I'll show is Poster House. Has just opened within the past year on 23rd Street between 23rd and 24th. And this was an existing volume of space that we knew we'd have to provide a kind of thermal enclosure for the display of the work. There needed to be a humidity control for this gallery. On the other hand, there's this amazing kind of possibility of the promenade. It was a museum for posters, so we should put the posters on display as if they're part of a street. So how do we kind of torque that gallery so that it becomes part of a street and still has the dimensions to work as a gallery? Lots of different studies and different tests, but ultimately we end up kind of thickening this side. And by intersecting these kind of vectors or lines, we then kind of located the front door at just simply the intersection of these two very simple kind of lines as they cross down the length of this 220 foot space. The other side would then be filled with this very large piece of furniture. I should note that this is about 2 feet higher than it is here. So this millwork package was really quite a bit of a nightmare to build, to get it to all work. And again, that intersection occurring at that moment. What we like very much is this idea that the gallery space and that space of the street would then start to form a kind of a line or a registration between some of the existing volume and then the nested interior that we had added into the project. But to find a way that you would actually transgress that line line would be visible, but almost more as a kind of an optical effect of the long axis of the view. Here, a view down the line towards the entry into the gallery, a view back. Again, this kind of registering the difference between the promenade down the side And then on the left-hand side, the space of the gallery. The gallery is relatively straightforward. The exception, we wanted to make sure that these amazing cast iron columns, their capitals would be put on display and lit. Lumen Architects were our lighting designer. They did a fantastic job with us. And even at the front where there's quite a bit of thickness, having those capitals be visible. As I said at the beginning, hybrids are really where most of the pleasure of architecture occurs, right? So this is, where architects can start to combine. So we'd like to now be able to look at Sana's Rolex Learning Center and say, well, it's basically an extruded stacked section that's then been shaped and perforated with a series of holes. So, and the consequences of each of those operations are visible within the project. Or the petting zoo of section, Seattle Public Library. You can look in terms of a shaped section, an incline, a stacked section, etc. So the purpose of the book is really to provide greater clarity and understanding and to make legible these different qualities within architecture, so they can be then capitalized on it and move further, right? So it's meant as a kind of learning tool. So we're in the process of doing a book about houses, in part because it allows us to look at smaller scale, look at tectonics, look at assembly, but only to do it with houses that either sequester carbon or are built from natural materials found on sites. This is very much in progress. We've only modeled about 20 of the buildings so far. It's an interesting case where we're trying to find a way that if you look at these materials and take them seriously, how could they be a catalyst for innovation in section? The book started out just looking at houses directly, but it's morphed over the 2 years we've been working on it to now solely focus on questions of materials that are sequestering carbon, because it's a radical shift has to happen in architecture, and we're trying to find a way to make this work be legible and be the point of departure for more projects around the world. So the last kind of book I want to touch on just a little bit is the Manual of Physical Distancing. And this was an open source book. It was just made available at the end of the summer. And what we tried to do here, and this is really coming, started in the end of April, when we started to read, and everyone was kind of trying to digest all of this scientific paper about COVID, about what does it mean, what are the spatial effects, and working with our colleague Guy Nordenson, structural engineer at Princeton, we decided to actually use architecture's ability to visualize these things to make this stuff more legible, and then also to get into kind of questions of what are the possible spatial impacts, not just the spatial consequences of COVID and how it spreads, but also are there ways we can start mapping out some of the urban consequences of COVID and the urban consequences of pandemics in general. It's about a 211-page book. We worked very hard for about 3 months trying to get it out. It was important to get it out as quickly as possible. We worked almost exclusively in section and section axonometric so that dimensional specificity was clear within the work. Looking at both kind of visualizing scientific papers, looking at interiors, urban spaces, case study, and then looking at the history of global pandemics. So I'll just go through a couple of these quickly. One of the key things was just trying to make these things visible. And again, we were hearing lots of reports, but there was not a lot of kind of clear understanding of what this actually meant. Now at this point, it's pretty well known. But back in April and May, there was what are we talking about? Why, how is it that different countries have different dimensions they're working with? What are the roles of masks? What are the different types of masks? Could we make this use architectural techniques? The question that is still being worked through, although there's a bit of a better understanding, is what is the relationship between interior air exchanges, the amount of particles that distribute, et cetera. So trying to make what was known as visible as possible, redrawing some of the well-known case studies that, frankly, the diagrams that were spreading in CNN were actually quite terrible. They're really hard to read. And so we wanted to draw them better, like make this stuff more easy to understand what the consequences were. And then move into the urban question. So as we look at existing streets, and there's the possibility of taking a large amount of real estate on the streets away from private cars. It shouldn't be. Parked cars should be eliminated as much as possible. What might that mean? Certainly the restaurants that have occurred now, one's quite familiar with, but what are the future models that should be implemented? How can we look at what this might be? We looked at a variety of different contexts, whether it's market streets, short-term, long-term, looking at ways that the pedestrian role might be intensified within the city, whether it's temporary or on a more permanent basis, and what are the kind of kit of parts that are being deployed, how might they be used in other ways. Some questions about the subway systems and social distancing, and then the role of bicycles. So just trying to work with the RPA's bicycle plan and figure out ways that there are bottlenecks. And we worked on a couple of different sites to try to unpack some of these joints, because the bike path, a bike network is only good as the network, not the individual path. So, you know, path isn't good if it dead ends into a bunch of traffic. So, and then working with Jackson Heights, with the Neighborhoods Now program, with Van Allen Institute and the Urban Design Forum, working very closely with the neighborhood to develop more immediate strategies, open streets and open restaurants program, but then also visioning possible more longer term benefits and ways to rethink the city according to this. So the last thing I want to touch about is the COVID is by no means the first nor the last pandemic, right? It's probably one of many, and we will have others. But part of our interest was to say, what are the ways in which historic pandemics have influenced architecture? I think we're just scratching the surface of this, but for us, one of the interesting things was to understand that the pandemics in the past that have had the most direct influence were the ones where the duration, either the duration of how long the disease existed or how long it affected the human body, tended to have the greater consequence on impacting architectural form. So for example, Ebola has yet to have, even though it's a horrific disease, has not had those duration consequences. So it doesn't have as much direct consequence on urban form, whereas cholera, for example, has had huge impact. So we just looked at and tried to draw a couple of these, the Venetian, the way in which Venice, and I can't go through this in too much detail, but the way in which Venice was really structured to deal with the plague, and the way in which certain architectures were formed at organization, thresholds, control, interior-exterior relationships, all these ways in which walls and segregation and quarantining was then made manifest within the architecture, which is super fascinating. Looking at cholera in New York City and the way that water was distributed and the transformations of this water system relative to dealing with cholera and other diseases that were a consequence of impure water. And then also looking at Roosevelt Island. It's an amazing island that Michael and Marion have worked on, but the history of it is largely as a kind of site of different forms of quarantine, different hospitals. And one of the ones that we became very interested in is smallpox and polio hospital, in part because questions of access and egress and light and air were all made legible within the building itself. Circulation corridors, pathways, orientations towards sunlight, etc. But so trying to kind of take stock of some of the best or the most visible examples of the ways in which this would impact the city. So I'll stop there. But so for us, really, the book is a kind of repository of a kind of knowledge, but knowledge that's meant to be made available for others, right? So we see a lot of the work of the office being organized and then disseminated through the agency of the book because of its ability to be legible and transmissible as a medium. Although the manual of physical distancing was never printed because we knew that the duration, that long it took to get a book printed, it wasn't going to get out in time. So it was just made available on the web. But anyways, pleasure being here, and I will stop at that point.
Thank you, Paul, for your generous presentation and your generous contribution, obviously, to our field. I'm going to pass back the mic to David Diamond, who will address some questions for Michael Manfredi.
Okay, thank you very much to both speakers. Because of the format, I'll address my first question to Michael. So I want to thank you for sharing with us a remarkably varied body of work that also is amazingly well aligned with your values of ethical and inclusive practice. I would first also like to thank Pablo and my colleagues who set the theme for this semester's lecture series. Correlational crises seems to be ominously appropriate for the moment we live in, where we are all victims to disruptions in our social fabric, economic and political systems, and to our political well-being. And each of these, directly or indirectly, correlate to our disruptions to our ecosystems. Yet, Michael, what I see in your work is in fact a kind of joyful optimism that amid correlational crises, you and Marian Weiss find correlational opportunities to leverage those small pieces of a project that are achievable to promote effects that resonate far beyond the boundaries of a project's construction, to embrace both proximate and remote contexts within the body of your work. You have said that the conventional definition of architecture is too narrow, and I offer this one to my students, that architecture's primary role is to mediate between us and the world around us. Your work offers countless positive examples of this principle. So here's the question. I'm always fascinated by the processes by which projects take form, and especially so when these processes involve multiple voices, from specialized consultants to the general public, and in multiple media, from Conte crayon gesture sketches to precise digital diagrams, and to sorting through streams of non-visual information around which your work evolves. Can you please comment on the process of a project's taking shape?
Okay, that was a good good question and great segue. Let me just first start by maybe redefining, I think, what seems to be very important, but somewhat perhaps too casually framed, which is the idea of multidisciplinary thinking, which is, of course, I think the subtext to what Mary and I have been doing, and I think also LTL. But I'm also reminded of Hal Foster's comment that before you have multidisciplinary thinking, you have to have disciplinary thinking. And I think that's particularly important in the context of an academic institution. We have to sort of know what architecture can do, what it can't do, know its limits, and then perhaps enter into a broader conversation. So I want to just put that out there because I think in studio settings, we're all kind of sometimes seduced by the idea that if only we could just be multidisciplinary, solutions would immediately rise to the surface. I think maybe I would answer your question, David, perhaps obliquely, which is the capacity for form. For form to become a way in which you can galvanize a very broad constituency around a very broad set of topics. And again, I could point to a number of projects that LTL has been doing. This is not a function of scale, but as we've kind of been pushing projects in a kind of public realm, we've been reminded consistently of the capacity of form to become a way, a nexus of conversation and a nexus of engaging different voices, because otherwise it's all in the abstract. And we've been through a number of very contentious community meetings, and you pull a model out and suddenly different voices, different agendas coalesce around something that's tangible and something that is perhaps in a way an opportunity to kind of break the Gordian knot of different voices that often can't see eye to eye. So I think that optimism perhaps comes from our deep belief in form's capacity to engage broader constituencies and broader conversations. And in fact, I think broader processes, whether they're environmental, social, or cultural. So we always try, I think, again, I'm answering your question somewhat obliquely, to bring the conversation around ways in which we can identify an architectural response that, while extraordinarily specific, has a larger, more expansive agenda and can, I think, communicate a set of urgency to and a set of agency to a broader public. So I hope that maybe has helped steer that conversation to a productive conclusion.
I can't remember a time when my teachers didn't speak to me in oblique terms, so that works.
Me too.
Wonderful. I think that, you know, it would be great if Paul could also chime in on this topic. You know, the way that you've presented your project is really seamless in, you go from research to interior design, to architecture, to urban design, to practice, back to research in seamless way. And I would like for you to address our students directly in your approach and the way that you, you know, your personal beliefs are driving your practice and really making this possible for you.
Yeah, it's in some ways it's a tough question to answer because you know, we tend to approach each project slightly differently, I would say. But I do think that there is a general argument, and I really like Michael's argument that you have to know a discipline well in order to transgress it. I think that's really key. And so for us, a lot of the things that hold much of this work together is a real interest in the agency of drawing and representation. And, you know, for me, you know, it's the well-known quote by Robin Evans that what distinguishes architecture from other visual mediums is that we don't actually produce the thing that we're working on. We work through translations, and the power of a drawing is not that it's one and one. It doesn't have a perfect correspondence. In fact, its distinction from the very thing it's representing is where its power is gained. So we tend to really privilege the role of drawings and work through drawings, and that is frankly also what occurs within academia, right? I mean, I think it's a great pleasure to be able to not be burdened by the thing itself, right? To be able to work through the abstraction of drawings, but then also to recognize that when you go into the nuance of understanding what a drawing does, that each drawing is kind of unique and different, and they do different things. They show things, they hide other things. And so for us, the obsession with drawings and really unpacking it and trying to figure out what do they do, what do they reveal, what do they hide, how can we use them in other directions, that if there is a kind of commonality behind all the work, it's that all of it is done through largely, and this is, you know, not exclusive to us, but it's done through a heavy investment in what is the agency of drawing, and how can you develop a kind of an expertise so that you're aware and able to manipulate it to certain ends. I think Michael's point about the ability for architectural representations, whether models or drawings, to make clear to an audience larger than just simply an informed architecture audience is really crucial, right? But that doesn't mean you don't enjoy the pleasure and the complexity of drawings that may only be read by trained architects, but it's that full breadth, right? You can do both. And so we become very interested in where you can have super precision and then legibility at the same time. So, but yeah, that's my oblique way of saying the way I answer that is drawings. So, but it's a really good, and that's what students do. I mean, I can't emphasize enough that the distinction between the drawing and the architecture is really where your agency lies. So you have to be able to understand and work drawings to your own ends. So
I think that's a perfect answer for our students that are here.
So thank you. So I'll take it from here. So again, thank you, Paul and Michael, for your presentations. So amazing presentation, very inspiring and provocative, and I think are bringing a lot of a set of important issues to the table for discussion tonight. So I'll address a question to both, expanding a little bit on perhaps on some of the points that the Saskia Sassen is not here tonight, but expanding a little bit on the brief that she sent for this panel discussion, and in particular talking about knowledge production and formation. And also has this relates, to this panel discussion, looking at vision and trajectory for both higher education and practice. So one thing to argue is that in a way, historically, knowledge silos have worked well for us. So separation historically, so in the past, have worked well for us in the sense that they were able to shape somehow differences in knowledge formation. And looking specifically at, in a way that we're divided. But today we know that silos is operating as the opposite. So working against complex knowledge formation, and especially preventing form of innovation and the emergence of possibilities at all levels. So I think some of the project presented touched upon the capacity of architecture to be able to carry agencies on multiple scales. I think from your project, Paul, when you looked at performative materials, and I think to some of the Michael's project, looking at larger landscape projects. And again, I think looking at agency across scales and as a interscalar and multiscalar condition. So through this framing, so the question looks more at, so what do you think, what are the current challenges and opportunity, especially on how we approach education, and perhaps going back to the notion of knowledge silos in relation to pressing global issues. And I'm speaking about this also through the lens of our Master in Urban Design programs, because these are very important themes that we discuss with the students throughout the curriculum and through the different work that we do. And so again, the question is more specific about how we approach education and how education in relation to pressing global issues.
That's a great question, and I'm going to encourage Paul to start to answer that first as an associate dean. Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Thanks. That's a really hard question. And I guess the thing that one thing that I am always struck by is, well, I want to answer it in two ways. One is that architecture, despite the fact that it has disciplinary boundaries, architects are by definition a kind of a generalist, right? So we're purposely having to expand, to become lawyers. We have to kind of become code experts. We have to become, technical software experts. We're perpetually, having whether, and depending on who you're engaging, you have to almost become community organizers. So I would argue that it's very hard to actually become siloed at architecture because you're constantly having to work horizontally to engage all kinds of different things. So that's the first point. The second one is, I think that the global challenges are really tough. And that's stating it, stating the obvious, but they're tough for architecture in part because if one really takes seriously the climate crisis, it makes it very hard to build, say, in concrete. It makes it very hard for you to justify a massive amount of embodied carbon in a new building. And that's been kind of a stock and trade for what we teach in architecture, as we tend to teach, the new construction, the new city, the new building, the new thing. And I think that the increasing concern about, the constant consumption of resources and the kind of effects make it, in a sense, forces one to pause about what you're doing. And that's tricky. And so, I think that, and I don't want the flip side to be not building, right? Or not transforming cities or making things better. But I think the way in which we go about them is probably going to shift. And so for me, those are the kind of two kind of pressing questions. This idea of the generalists and the idea that a lot of what we valued in the last 200 years, or even the definition of what we do in architecture and urban design, is shifting pretty radically and has to shift pretty radically. And the definitions of what we now need to do and how we need to do it is being formed and isn't formed, which is tricky. It's really tricky. So I think it puts a lot of pressure on schools to rethink what they're doing. Puts a lot of pressure on architects to reimagine what is a moral approach to architecture. These are tough questions, and they're evolving, and they're going to continue to be ones that we're going to have to face.
Yeah, I would. Thank you, Paul. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but you did so well that I do want to kind of piggyback a few thoughts, Marcella, because it's a very good question and I think a very urgent one. I think we are generalists, and I hope that in the sort of as the world moves increasingly towards specialization, where, you know, even at age 12, you have to kind of determine where you're going to go, what you're going to study, and your parents are in a panic if you're, you know, not taking Mandarin Chinese or learning computer programming. I hope that architectural education doesn't abandon its capacity to provide a very broad general education, because I think that's where problem solving is likely to be most fruitful. I would also argue, and maybe I'm feeling extraordinarily optimistic tonight, but we're working on a number of tech buildings that call themselves innovation hubs, which is, of course, a very tired and overused word, but they keep coming back to the practice of architecture as a discipline that is based around, and the teaching of architecture based around projects. And they go to architectural offices, architectural studios, whether it's Penn or Harvard or Princeton, and say, this is what we want our culture, our corporate culture, to be like. And I think that means to me, I think, and to those who are teaching, is that we have been working in a kind of and leading a way of doing work and doing research in terms of it being collaborative, it being project-based, it not being completely siloed. So I think we should sort of take stock with what we have been doing and doing it well. I would say that the kind of environmental urgency and the urgency that this last pandemic has sort of foisted on us all also reminds us that there is a capacity for architecture, and particularly a capacity for architecture to broadly redefine itself. And I think Paul's diagram of different crises, whether it was cholera, bubonic plague, have sadly all resulted in massive transformations of infrastructure and architecture. And the modern movement would not have existed without the kind of specter of cholera, the devastation of World War I. So one hopes that we will learn to kind of trigger a quick and fruitful response in the context of the pandemics that are likely to reoccur in probably increasingly short cycles. So there is something about it forcing us to kind of think about architecture. And again, you think perhaps of Aalto's extraordinary work in response to tuberculosis, the invention of furniture, surfaces, materials, architectural strategies, relationships of buildings to clean and fresh air. I think that argues for architecture not being embarrassed or ashamed of its kind of history, but actually moving it forward.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe I can just comment quickly, I think, on this and expand. And again, I didn't ask the question because I had the response, right? But I think it's, again, through the presentation, but also the panel itself, I think that's, and also because of our students, I think also we are architect practitioners and academic, bring us back to the responsibility of thinking about those issues. So going, I think, back to your point, Michael, I think urgency it's a very important category that now that somehow it's asking us to give response quickly, but also at the same time, I think we are witnessing both in practice and in academia, the acceleration of processes. So I think urgency and acceleration are going hand in hand. And again, I'm not talking about only academia, but I'm talking about in practice, and I think in more, transversal knowledge across different disciplines, I would say. So, and I think urgency, actually, if we just look at architecture and urbanism, has the capacity to establish a projective capacity for the future. So it's not only how fast we give response, but also the fact that we have a certain timeline to give responses. So I think Paul's catalog, I think, start to bring together some of these issues that also we can look at a more systemic approach, right? How everything is entangled, how everything affects each other. But I believe also that the disruption of events has a possibility to project the future, and to quickly be able to respond, which doesn't mean that the responses are right or wrong, right? Because also who can judge that? But I think also, to the work in academia, we have the responsibility to project out, to ask those questions and be able to work with the student in terms of projected futures, which I think is very important. If we talk about, again, relationship between practice and academia and how the two are completely entangled and connected.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think one of the interesting things about architectural projection is that, and I think the idea of a kind of speculative future is very powerful. And part of what makes architectural representation so seductive and so effective is it has the kind of capacity to be have the appearance of being objective. It's measurable. It has a kind of specificity. The kind of laying out of the plan. There's a dimensional kind of precision possible, and there's also a kind of there's a believability that comes with. And these are great tools, right? So, one of the things that makes visions of the future played out through architectural means so seductive is that there's the appearance that they aren't just kind of a self-aggrandizing kind of wish, but they've been worked through a kind of a larger collective body. There's this sense that this isn't a single person's will, but it's a kind of being worked through at multiple levels. And I think that's really look, architecture is basically a kind of speculation about the future that might happen. It's kind of bizarre, right? Again, the idea that the drawing comes before the work, right? That's for me, that's one of the great pleasures of what happens within school, is to take seriously what's all the problems and challenges that are going on, and then to envision a possible future, right? And to then test it out through those means, drawings, et cetera, and to work it iteratively. So again, I'm very optimistic about the ways that architecture operates, and I think the terms under what we consider valuable, I think, are probably shifting and probably need to shift, but the agency of drawings, the agency of speculative design, I think is that you described it very well. It is a kind of, it's a possible future that being put forward, and that's what makes it so. That's why people go to architecture school. I mean, that's why we're involved in architecture. We want to have beneficial consequences on the future. So. Yeah,
I think one has to be an optimist, I think, fundamentally to engage in the world in which we love. But also, I would just want to further emphasize, I think, the capacity for iterative thinking, whether it's through drawings, models, analog, digital, it almost doesn't matter. I think what we're increasingly interested in is the capacity to have a very large toolbox, not to be blinded or seduced by particular methodologies. And I think in order to be, agile And in order to kind of confront new realities, which architecture should and must do, I think we have to kind of shed the idea of a monolithic particular approach that is either too systemic, too narrow, or tends to not involve a kind of a truly iterative process. And I think how perhaps you guys work at LTL, how some students work, how you guys are teaching and finding that kind of reciprocity between student, teacher, teacher to student, I think is crucial in the continued relevance of architectural education.
Absolutely. I would like to invite the audience also, if you have some questions for our distinguished guest, you're welcome to post or to make yourself heard. We would like to hear from the students as well and engage in your questions as well. But in the meantime, Paul, I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on your focus in interior design in your office. We have, our school is architecture and design, and our interior design students are also present. And I was wondering if you could elaborate in the role of your practice and its interiors, specifically to the point of the crisis that we've been going through right now.
It's a really good question. I mean, one way I like to talk about the important role of interiors is simply through the fact that even in cities, we spend most of our time indoors, right? So we know this, right? We know that despite the emphasis on the exterior of the architectural form, it's the interior that actually is inhabited. That's where a lot of time is spent. And to be honest, the role of what we try to do with the manual section is actually talk about interiors, right? It's not the exterior effect of the section in the city. In fact, that's the weakness of the book. The book is not very good at describing how buildings intersect with the ground or with urban context. It's mostly how's the interior organized. That was our focus, right? And I think that comes out of a real interest of the role of the interior as being something that does kind of choreograph people's relationships to each other, the nature of how a building unfolds and is inhabited and changes over time. I think we've always been as concerned about the sense of what it's like to be in something as we are, and perhaps more so than we are the way it might look as an object from the outside. So, but and I think that the question, one of the pandemic's raised lots of questions. Some are going to disappear in the sense that I think concerns about certain concerns are not going to hold sway, but others I think are. And one of the interesting things is the need to think about the interior as not hermetically sealed, right? So the idea that the interior and exterior should be a transmissive, an exchange. The idea of series of gradients. The idea that you don't have a front door that's a threshold between the sidewalk and the inside, but in fact, the inside starts to spill out to the urban public. That kind of blurring of those spaces, I think, is very beneficial. I think it makes for a more interesting city. It makes for a healthier nature of building. And I hope that kind of expanding of skins and opening up of windows, quite literally, will continue to play a role within how we think about frankly the role of interiors. There's another whole economic realm that is probably beyond the subject of this, which is what happens with all this interior stuff that's been built and may not be used as much. And then what are the kind of systemic consequences of the reduction of that many people in the role of storefronts, and how do you rethink that? I mean, I think that's gonna be fascinating to see how it unfolds for the next couple of years or decades. So, but that's as much an economic one as is an architectural question.
Michael, for you, you can follow up with that question. I mean, your space at Barnard College is amazing. That is an interior space, but actually behaves almost like a public outdoor area, and I would like to, and it's also included in the book, so perhaps it's a point for you to also.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Trudy, and we're very pleased and honored that section was included. I think it also had to do with the publicness of the interior, which is particularly in that building, which is a kind of a multi-use building, different activities from eating to library to art making, somehow were nested together. We tried to kind of take those and sort of peel them apart, and to do it through the means of the section, and in this case, a series of interior ascending voids. But it was also a chance, I think, and maybe, Paul, this is where you were going, although the building is somewhat hermetically sealed, by virtue of it cascading down into a cafe that opens up onto Millman Courtyard. There's a kind of sense of meeting the ground, using this sort of sectional idea to meet the ground plane, but also at the very top, there's skylit. So it's always earth to sky, and a sense of the geography of a building, because I think one of the things that is particularly interesting in interiors is the recognition that there is a geography to the interior world. And I think one of the more interesting sectional developments that I think Paul's and LTL's book sort of in a way revealed for us is the kind of geography of the interior. And that does, I think, also point to ways in which I think in this recent pandemic, the reciprocity between inside and outside isn't just a kind of a pleasurable or beautiful condition, it's also a condition of health.
Yeah, I think that is a great point of commonality in the two presentations that you've each made, and each one reinforces another of my favorite definitions of architecture, which is that rather than being something to look at architecture, good architecture is something to look through. In other words, architecture becomes a lens through which one understands one's place in the world, or one's place in a landscape, or one's place within the context of other spaces. So that was more of a comment than a question, but I'm also grateful to you both for making that so clear. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the amazing things about the center at Barnard is when you're deep back in that space, like you're almost all the way through the space, you actually feel more connected to the part of the building that's the furthest away from you. It's this amazing way in which you stretch almost the lawn up and into the building. And what I also think is really important in this and is that each of those terraces, it's not just an atrium space, but each of those spaces are inhabited with activity. And so when you look down, you get this sense of the density of activity and the human relations and how you're part of that. So it's not just a kind of an optical effect, it really is a social consequence, which it's that mixing of an understanding of the architectural space, and then the question of how the social program can be intensified or activated through a specific calibration of that space. This is an extraordinary building. So,
what I found interesting thank you for sharing your work in your presentation, is that there's a kind of a common ground, which is the approach or the understanding of architecture as a way of building knowledge, as a way of building knowledge and building expertise. So building knowledge through making, which is crucial, and which crosses academia and professionalism and professional field, and was evident. And if this is, in any case, it's a kind of a establishing system of relationship. I remember the famous Tafuris, and the section clarifies relationship, the plans clarifies proportions. And I see through the project that you presented, both Michael and Paul, that there is this need of understanding the section as a way of clarifying relation between interior space, between interior and exteriors, but becomes also the section is never just a flat sections. Your section, Paul, were 1-point perspective sections. the section of Michael's drawing become AXO exploded section. So it's a way of almost like chirurgically, as Rossi said, going and unveil and in some way discover the reasons of the project, exploding the project from inside. But it's never about just the project as an object. It's about the project understood in the field as a potential to build a context and as reaction to that context, which is very clear to the section that you showed and your red arrows that were going in and out, or through the Michael's images of the project, where the mirror effect, the filtering, the transparency becomes a way of, and the same kind of formal structure of the building. It's reading and it's kind of taking on the responsibility of building a context, which is something that has been up in the last 20 years in architecture, even though previous architects have done that, but in different way, but was still clear the idea of a box on a plateau in some way, even though even Le Corbusier broke that plateau, letting the stairs going down. But there is this idea now of taking on bigger responsibilities of being also involved in defining the quality of the context that we are building, why we are building the object itself.
Yeah, very good. I'm reminded of the comment, and I can't quite trace its origins, but you can understand the plan intellectually through your mind. It's an intellectual, it's an abstraction, but you understand the section through your body. I think it's particularly true when I looked at some of the sections that Paul described. You could actually feel the way you were moving through a building, feeling the weight of walking upstairs or sliding down a ramp or sliding across a surface in a very visceral way. And I think I'm reminded, as the world becomes increasingly more visually focused and we're consumed with a kind of digital representation of reality, architecture's capacity, which is increasingly important, is to remind us of our bodies moving through space. And I think that's a sectional idea first and foremost.
Right. And it's interesting how this is then the most difficult part, right? So having the understanding of the experiential quality of the space that you design, which becomes kind of easier with time and while you do it. But for students, it's very difficult to imagine themselves as part of a journey. And that journey builds the compositional aspect of their project and the kind of environmental qualities and tactile qualities, haptic qualities of the space that are designed. This is very difficult, but it's very crucial now more than ever to understand that the system that we talk about, across in scale, multi-scale, and coordinated differently with different expertise, they at the hand have to produce experiential journeys, experiential qualities that are coming from materials, from relationship, but they are related to the body. So it's crucial, the presence of the body in these spaces.
I also particularly want to thank Michael and Paul, as well as our colleagues at NYIT, to organize this, because in a way, interiors are always informed by the exteriors, and the exteriors synthesize the concept within the interior space. So in a way, it's a wonderful thing for us this evening to hear from Michael and Paul about their work and their and informing our students about the relationship of these two.
And one thing I was going to recommend to students is next time you're in a 3D model or Rhino, don't spin around the Rhino model. like don't revolve the Rhino model over and over and over again. Actually go into it and see how slow you can move while you're in it. Just see if you can kind of like very, very subtle, like how slow can you actually inhabit your Rhino model, just as an experiment. So, because we know how fast it can be spun, the real question is how can you slow it down, and what happens when you start looking at the subtle differences of being, 2 feet over, a foot higher, etc. So it's anyways, Rhino is a kind of tool that is both incredibly powerful, but also comes with its own burdens, not the least of which it's incredibly powerful. So
I think that's good advice for all of us, Paul, not the students. I would say the other thing too, that I think increasing, and this is, I think, goes to a kind of an environmental agenda, is to take the Rhino model and situate it. Often it's spun around in the abstraction, so there's no sense of orientation, sun, climate, wind patterns. We're always kind of struggling to ground something, and then you can kind of give it measure and find it. So sort of ecological balance as well. So spin it slowly, very, very slowly, as Paul said, and then ground it, and then look at it again.
I think we have a question from Nader Vasuri, our faculty, that it's consistent with this topic, right?
Yes. So I think that the question that we have in the chat expand, I think, on some of this point in relation to representation and experience. So, so could you expand on your experience with architectural representation on the internet specifically, and architectural communication on the internet, how this has happened, how this has been maybe a challenge or raised new opportunities for you as educators?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would argue that the biggest loss from Zoom and in education, which we probably all would agree, is the loss of studio culture, the kind of casual exchange, the running into people, kind of witnessing things happening over your shoulder, the kind of chatter, all the kind of social qualities that you can't be replaced in Zoom, right? That is the biggest loss. And certainly model making is part of that, the kind of physical act, and all the things that have to happen in space and the cumulative effect of people in space. On the other hand, I would argue that a desk crit with a touch screen is pretty good on Zoom. Like the one-on-one is okay. So, but it's dependent upon drawing. Like, so I've become kind of, you probably saw the lecture, I have to constantly draw. I have to use the touch screen to be able to interact, because otherwise it's just words that float out there. And so the desk crit, which I usually for me involves lots of sketching, can translate pretty easily into the screen. I think, but as soon as you move beyond the one-to-one, even kind of small group reviews, you lose a lot. You lose the dynamics, and it starts to kind of get worse and worse the larger the group is. Miro is kind of useful as a pinup and allows you to zoom in and out, but it has its own limits. But I think if there is one good thing, I think that the immediacy of the one-on-one, because all the work is being done often digitally anyways, you can get right to it. I think that works fairly well. But I miss all the unintended things that occur in a studio.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the question also had to do with the internet. Is that, am I remembering the question? So I'll just, if that's not the case, I'll put my 2 cents in there. Often we're asking students to do research, and of course, the first thing you do is you go on the internet. And I think we, particularly when it has to do with looking at other buildings, and the danger, of course, that we always try to resist, I think, is the tendency to forget that everything we're getting is already mediated, it's already filtered, and there's a kind of a danger to going onto the site that's most easily accessible and assuming that that's dogma. And I think we have to kind of resist that. And I think we're finding the downside of the internet is information's very, very heavily skewed and heavily mediated. And that's true if you're doing research that might relate to an architectural project.
I have a question from a student. What inspires your personal approach to form when the potential for pushing those boundaries become more accessible, and our definitions of boundaries are constantly being redefined by culture and context. So personal.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah. What inspires your personal approach to form when the potential for pushing those boundaries become more accessible and our definitions for boundaries are constantly being redefined by culture and context? I'm not sure if we understand, but maybe perhaps the idea of, what influences your formal form finding approach, I would guess.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll take one way of perhaps approaching how I think I'd like to answer that question.
Yes.
A very good one. Let me praise the importance of boundaries, at least in our work. I think I probably speak for my partner as well. I think we would be absolutely paralyzed if we were given a kind of tabula rasa, both in terms of program, budget, and site. I think we're always trying to find edges, not only physical, but financial, cultural. And I think good projects emerge out of a high level of constraints. So we're always trying to find constraints, find boundaries to push the work in ways that we might not otherwise expect it to go.
Yeah, I have a suspicion many architects would deflect the question of personal form because it gets really, you could get, there's a lot of pitfalls to that problem. So I share Michael's argument that you look for the constraints, you look for the things that are external to your own self and try to leverage those as much as possible. And certainly one of the things that we often work with is the reciprocity between built form and drawing. And I mean that quite literally, that we often look for the line, we look for the kind of edge, we look for the threshold. The fact that Poster House does have a photograph that appears to have a line in it, that was absolutely intentional, and it was a built line at some level. So we often do rely on the abstraction of drawing as a kind of a point of departure for form making. And I will say, again, I've really enjoyed looking at Michael's and Marianne's work again, the way in which the charcoal as it turns becomes a kind of key component to certain roof lines. That's an effect of drawing, right? It's a ruled surface, but it's also the ability to go from edge to surface. Anyways. It's a tough question. So
yeah, the drawings are also amazing because they capture the non-visual parts of architecture, even though drawing is a visual means. So it's kind of fascinating, and that's again a comment that attaches to both of your presentations.
Yeah,
we have Professor Tom Bereves who has a question for you.
Yes, thank you very much for the wonderful presentations. I have a question to follow on from Professor Del Signore's queries about the limitations of disciplinary silos. Michael Manfredi, in your presentation, you talked from project to project about relationships between what I would say are disciplines and forms of practice between architecture and landscape, city, garden, infrastructure and ecology. And the discussion followed on about the disciplinary inclusivity, disciplinary transgressions, and it seems that the panel favors generalists over architecture or design as a form of general education or general practice over specialists or specialisms. And I guess my question is, why do we still have then in higher education titles of degrees and names of programs such as architecture, interior design, and urban design?
That's a question for me and Paul, Tom?
Well, for both, yes. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, it's a broad question. I think we could probably pose that to everyone. But there is a language to architecture that we share. So to the degree that one needs to understand architecture's capacities and its limitations, I think is quite important, and it is worth at a certain moment defining how that can be. It's like playing a piano. You have to learn a few basic pieces that allow you, I think, to then develop a kind of language that would allow you to enter into a conversation with other musicians. So, I mean, to a certain degree, yes, we're victims of the kind of silos we create, and we want to transgress those. But I think I also caution the alternative, which is a kind of complete free-for-all where it's hard to really bring anything of value to a conversation.
Yeah, I would probably argue that generalists and kind of disciplinary rigor are not at odds with each other. In fact, it's probably a little bit of both. But it's also one of the things that comes with, I mean, I've always loved the argument that the most amazing improvisational musicians are the ones who know the scales so well, they memorize them so they don't even have to repeat them, right? So that level of expertise has to reach such a high level that you then aren't burdened by the expertise, right? Or it allows for a kind of a more horizontal thinking. So yeah, it's a little bit of both. I mean, I think that there are different focuses, there are different aspects, there are different kind of natures of the disciplines that are useful. But as long as we don't see that those differences as somehow being absolute or being something that is about kind of territorial ownership, that somehow this line can't be crossed. I think the interest of the kind of focus on the discipline is not to shore up the discipline against other things, but to intensify its own capacity to then move beyond it, if that makes sense. So,
yeah, I think that the point, Paul, that I think is at the core of your question, Tom, is that being a generalist, I think, carries with it a certain responsibility to learn a language. And you then can, I think, approach a series of disciplines that architecture inevitably rubs up against in a more productive way.
I think we can take two more questions. We have a couple of more questions from the chat. So, so the first one asking, and the question is for both, if both of you can talk about different aspects of representation of interior and architecture design to the non-architectural public. When do you think, when you think about the representation of your work, how do you consider it differently from the context and the non-architectural viewer versus the thing to the designer? These apply to both representation of the work and the built product itself. I think this goes back to the some points about representation and the agency of drawings as well, to the specificity of scales as well of architecture.
It's an interesting question. I think there's a number of different permutations to that, so I'm not sure I'm going to answer it comprehensively. I wanted to talk a little bit about the degree to which people are incredibly visually astute. People, we're a culture saturated in images, right? And so that, a 30-second commercial might have 200 different cuts in it, the speed at which things occur. And I would argue that that architects underestimate the ability for people to read drawings and to be visually literate. But that's not, that doesn't apply to every single medium, right? So I think that mediums that are more rooted in optics, roles of perspectives, animations, etc., people are incredibly capable of digesting these. Where you get into kind of greater degrees of abstraction, and again, plans and sections are a good example. That's where the communication can break down a little bit. And I do argue that quite literally, one can look at the benefits of both together, right? And so our general approach is to use representations as a means to engage the greater, the public who might be involved in the project. So, and that our role is, if we can't make the work legible to as many people as possible, then we've failed in our responsibility. But that also means that we're not dumbing it down. We're actually trying to find a way that we speak to the expertise that people already have, and use that as a way to make the more abstract language of architecture then legible. And so in a sense, the question of, for me, the question of representation is a question of accessing and making available to as wide a public as possible, but to elevate that communication, not to kind of somehow underestimate the expertise.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we do drawings for different purposes. I think, there are drawings that are done as a way of communicating with a team that is completely internal and hermetic to the development of a process. There's a way in which, in my case, and I suspect Paul, we do drawings or sketches to communicate with our partners. And I think, so there are more abstract ways of thinking and drawing, sections being one of them. I found sections are extremely difficult for many people who are not conversant in architectural languages. So we found, particularly with public presentations, the way in which architectural ideas are conveyed rely on many, many different kinds of media: models, drawings, videos, and words. I can't underestimate the capacity of making a clear, cogent presentation and how critical that is. And that's one of the things I think architectural schools sometimes do very, very well and sometimes don't, is force us to frame our ideas in very, very clear ways that are intelligible to a very broad constituency with different agendas. And I think that's a tool too. That's a tool of communication just as important as a drawing might be. But we like to have a very broad array of tools to engage, folks, community groups, even sophisticated boards that you would think are extremely knowledgeable about architecture. We found that the variant of how people talk about architecture and how they read drawings and models is very, very, very varied. So we want to have lots of tools at our disposal.
I think we can see if there is any question from the audience. I think we can maybe one more live question, or maybe some of the people who have typed the question here on the chat, if you would like to ask the question live, or if there is any general question maybe from our students.
I think I saw.
Yeah, Stuart, Enrique have questions there. Don't be shy. It's easy to type the question, but it's equally easy to just say that aloud.
So,
hi, I'm Stuart. So my question was, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, as a student, I found it hard to find myself present in the site of my architectural project, figuratively and literally. And I often try to find like videos on Google or YouTube that try to capture those experiences, but I find it nonsensical because I'm not physically experiencing like the space. So can you speak on different modes or different means that one can become involved and present without the filters that you were speaking about earlier, like from Google?
Well, maybe I'll just jump in. I see, Paul, I think you're formulating probably a very intelligent response. Stuart, I think I would share your frustration. I think we're all living and hopefully coming out of an extremely bizarre, isolating experience where just the kind of haptic qualities of walking down a street and hearing sounds, we're all somewhat deprived. I mean, there's no substitute for actually, walking through a park, walking into a building, walking down a street, in terms of how it can be described. There are smells, there's temperature variance and all of that. And I think, the best you can do is rely on, as you said, rather inadequate YouTube representation. So I'm not sure there's an answer. I think the best we can do is to try to remind ourselves of what we're missing and try to recapture that when we kind of emerge or find ourselves in a truly physical condition. I mean, I wish right now we were sitting around a table talking to each other, but this is pretty good in that sense, and it gives us at least kind of a broader group of folks who might not be able to participate. So I think we have to kind of take our this particular moment, Stuart, with a bit of grain of salt, but also appreciate the ability to connect in slightly different ways, if only less fundamentally satisfying.
Oh, well, Paul, would you like to?
I was just going to, I mean, I think Michael answered it very well, which is it's a difficult dilemma. But the other thing that I might want to get at is that, the immersive experience of architectural representation is often going to frustrate an immersive experience, I guess is one way to put it. So, and I think that a lot of video and kind of ways that one can have a sense of being in a place. I've been spending way too much time on 3D VR recently, and there's some really interesting but also terrifying aspects of that coming out. But I wonder if there's a way that you can kind of look at and say, all right, what is it about the YouTube videos that you find so seductive that architecture doesn't quite live up to? And one example, I think, is to shift away from a kind of purely visual. And I was witnessing in a Zoom-based review, one student who presented drawings but had an overlay of a soundtrack. And as you were moving through the drawings, you could hear, different outside noises, interior noises, different effects. And it actually changed the reading of the drawing, right? I don't think that would have been possible if we all didn't have headsets on. We didn't have the ability to engage in that level, right? So I think there may be ways to think about, ways to connect visual mediums with other non-visual mediums. Sound is an obvious one, but I also think ways that you can kind of look at collaging video into drawings in ways that may be useful. I would argue that maybe it's a kind of an invention of representation that is the challenge, that maybe you're way out of your sense of deficiency of architectural mediums versus video-based immersive ones. But that, and then see what you do with it. I don't know, so.
Very inspiring comments. Thank you so much, Paul and Michael, for a wonderful presentation tonight. It has been such a treat to have you in our school. I wished we could speak for you with you guys for another hour, but I know that we've made a commitment and we would like to keep it that way so that when we invite you, you come again. Thank you so much for just your generous contribution tonight. It has been amazing. And also obviously for your generous contribution with your practices. I would like to, have the floor also for my colleagues in case they would like to speak also.
Thank you so very much for joining us this evening. It's been fantastic for us and for our students.
Same, thank you so much. And we hope to see you soon, maybe in person next time as well, or in this format. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you all.
Paul.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. And it's always a pleasure talking with Michael. So he's right over here to me. I can like shake his hand.
I always measure the success when I look at my watch and realize it's later than I thought. This was a very, very enjoyable and very engaging and tough and very good question. So thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.